So to kick things off, my name is Kate. I'm the Community and Program Coordinator here at Greater Washington. Greater Washington is a nonprofit organization that's based in Washington, D.C. And we do sort of media and advocacy work around building sustainable and equitable cities across the D.C. region. I am very pleased to be able to introduce one of our amazing volunteers who helped put this panel together, Saira Raman. She's going to talk a little bit about her work.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to see you guys in here. And please, as Kate said, continue to introduce yourselves in the chat. My name is Saira, and I'm a member of the Community Engagement Committee at Greater Washington. I really want to thank you all for taking the time to be here today. When I first started thinking about this panel, there was already a lot of heaviness in the world, and now I think there's even more, and I'm deeply saddened by everything that's going on, but I also really still believe in the power of people, and I believe in the power of people coming together and working together to make the world a better place. So for that reason, I'm very excited about this panel, and I'm very excited that we all took the time to be here today. If you're interested in learning more about Greater Washington or joining the over 500 members of the neighborhood, you can visit GGWash.org. And I want to thank Kate and the rest of the GGWash staff for helping me organize this, and also the speakers for taking their time. And I am now going to turn it back over to Kate.
Great. Thanks so much, Saira. So, as Saira mentioned, when we first sort of conceived of this panel, it was several weeks ago. We were thinking a lot about coronavirus and a lot about cities and sustainability in cities. And obviously, especially here in the United States, things have changed pretty rapidly over the last especially the last week. So I want to start today by just taking a moment to honor the brave individuals that are putting their health and safety at risk in order to stand up to police brutality and call out systemic racism. In cities across the world, low-income people of color have been forced to bear the brunt of environmental degradation, from the strategic location of heavy industry to highways to public parks. Power dynamics have always shaped what gets built where. And what's happening in DC right now and in cities across America is a stark reminder that there's no future for sustainable urbanism unless we're able to address white supremacy. I am super grateful for everyone being here today, and especially in these times. And without further ado, I am thrilled to be able to introduce today's panelists. We are joined today by Cooper Martin, who's the Director of Sustainability and Solutions at the National League of Cities, Professor Malini Ranganathan, who is with the School of International Service at American University, and Trey Sherard, who is the Outreach Coordinator and Biologist at the Anacostia Riverkeeper. Before we get into the heart of the conversation, I'd love to have each of you introduce yourselves. So I'll start with Trey, and then Malini, and then Cooper.
Sounds great. So my name's Trey Sherard. I'm the Anacostia Riverkeeper. I've been in DC for about 8.5 years, and I've been doing Anacostia Riverkeeper work almost that whole time. I've been able to live in Northwest and Northeast. I almost lived in Southeast, but not quite. I work in Southeast, so I get to see, and I get to work in Southwest some too. So the river is kind of fun for seeing DC because we get to see 3 quadrants all by boat.
Well, thank you so much to GGWash for organizing this panel. I'm a big fan of the really informative and progressive news and just types of information that GGWash provides. So as mentioned, I'm Associate Professor at the School of International Service at American University, where I research and teach courses on environmental justice in cities, specifically with the lens of critical race theory and urban geography. My doctoral training is in geography and political ecology. I also have faculty affiliations with the Metropolitan Policy Center, doing some great work in the DC region at AU, and the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at AU. You know, how I come to this work, I think is is through these lenses, and I'm really looking forward to discussing more with you. I'm also a Montgomery County resident, so I have some thoughts on the greater Washington, D.C. area.
And hello, Cooper Martin with the National League of Cities. We are the oldest and largest organization representing local government in the United States. We have about 2,400 member cities nationwide. And I run our Sustainable Cities programming as well as some of our resilience technical assistance. I also oversee some of our smart cities and urban innovation work. Our overall mission with the sustainability program specifically is to support, inform, and celebrate city-led sustainability efforts. So really, when our members come to us looking for resources, looking for guidance, that's when we step in and say, here's what we can do, and also maybe we can push you a little bit further. I come to this work with a little bit of a background in public policy. I spent, before this, 7 years working with the American Institute of Architects, so definitely an urban design and sort of planning and built environment perspective on that. And grew up in the Metro Kansas City area, but have been in DC for the last 13 years or so. So I'm definitely repping my old school pre-Silver Line Metro T today. And looking forward to the conversation. So thank you.
Great. Thank you all so much for being here. All right. So to kick things off, I am curious, what is sustainable urbanism and what do you all think it will look like after this pandemic? Trey, do you want to start?
Sure. So for our point of view, my point of view personally, I come from water and environment, and for our point of view as an organization, it's a lot about water. But as an urban river, the Anacostia River is kind of unique, so we don't get to talk about conservation and protection of the environment for the environment's sake. We have a lot of work that's very much people-based. So the thread just already tonight of sustainable urbanism really being woven in with people is a huge part of what we're looking at. For us, really getting people connected with their river, because it's such a big part of why DC is here in the first place. Actually, it's cited here because it has two rivers. More broadly, the U.S. turned away from its rivers. Literally, physically, cities turned away from their rivers during this past century and change. And in the past 20 or 30 years, cities were like, we have rivers. We like them now. They're not just places to do industry, and they're actually these huge assets that we have. And wow, where did this river come from? And most cities worldwide, so even more broadly, almost all cities worldwide are on some type of water, usually to do with some kind of port. So whether it's a river or a coastline, often the mouth of a river, sewing together the idea that the water and the environment and the people all really have to be looking at how those things interact.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'm going to try to answer the question of what is sustainable urbanism without using the usual suspect types of words. As a professor, when I talk about sustainability, I notice that my students who are, mainly 20 years old, born 2 decades ago, they already start getting a little bit cynical about this term, to be very honest with you. And so I'm going to try to define it, not with recourse to the usual and typical ways we define it, but really trying to think, more philosophically and capaciously about this, and then getting to your question as well about what it will look like, or what I hope that it will look like after the pandemic. So to me, as someone who studies environmental justice, racial disparities in the US with a focus in Washington, DC, but also does work globally in post-colonial cities of the Global South, I've come to understand that sustainable urbanism is essentially about building cities in which people and the resources that they so depend on can flourish, not just today, but into the future as well. And by flourish, I don't just mean materially. Of course, there are sort of basic material conditions that people need. but also emotionally, spiritually, and mentally. And that to me is really what sustainable means. And it's about prioritizing the life chances of those who have been marginalized and systematically oppressed. And I think sustainability and sustainable urbanism really needs to center this notion of prioritizing those that have thus far, not been able to flourish in cities. And so for me, it's very, very attached to the notion of equity. As far as what we can imagine for this frame of sustainable urbanism after the pandemic, I think that we should continue some of the emergent and hopeful threads that many of the cities that are part of this region are already doing, in counties, right? So whether it's Montgomery County or Northern Virginia and DC, there's some really exciting conversations about racial equity. And I think we should continue that work, throughout in the post-pandemic period, if there's such a thing, because I think we'll be living with this virus and its ramifications for a while to come. So that work should be continued. There are threads that are really emergent, that are really strong, that should be continued, that are already happening in the greater Washington area. However, I also think that there are certain things that we need to retool and we need to refocus. And so for me, there are 4 things that I really think that we need to change, or perhaps change or do more intentionally. The first is we need to redouble our efforts to think intersectionally about how housing inequity, the lack of health insurance, transit inequity, food inequity, all of these things work together to reduce people's life chances, right? And people don't live life in vacuums and through single issues. And so we really need to think about how to be more supple and nimble in the ways that we address these issues intersectionally. Montgomery County in February 2020 released a great working group report on climate adaptation, and they use this great sentence that I'm going to quote for you here. They say, quote, "The county must move forward from institutionalizing racial equity and social justice towards intersectional policy improvements," end quote. Right? Intersectional policy improvements is exactly what I'm thinking about when we need to act more intentionally. The second is that I think we need to think about, in this sustainable urbanism frame, the ways in which climate and health intersect and are both threat multipliers and exacerbate all manner of legacy inequities. And are we prepared for that? Right? The ways in which these two extraordinarily present threats, right, are actually threat multipliers. And then third, I think we need to avoid the tendency to use sustainability as a greenwashing term, just as sort of a form of branding, as a form of kind of real estate development that ultimately is exclusionary. I've noticed these trends, and I want to guard against them, right, in a post-COVID era, or continuing to live with the virus, but able to be resilient to the virus kind of era. And finally, I really think that while we've kind of reinstilled this faith in science, both because public health experts have been weighing in and we've been trusting them, and because by implication, we're also kind of hopefully, trusting more and more climate science, I think that we also have to avoid this tyranny of experts. And experts do know a lot, but it's also, the communities also know a lot. And in fact, communities are, embedded more vernacularly. And so I think experts need to also pay attention to local communities. And I hope that is intensifies post-COVID and not kind of let go of community input.
Great, thank you.
And talking with our members, elected leaders, council members, a lot of non-sustainability professionals, usually I give these definitions and then make a joke that none of my definitions are going to hold up in a master's thesis or anything. So there's nothing I can really add from an academic or educational or many other perspectives that are going to add to what Malini just said. So ditto to that. One of the things that I often find myself doing is defining words in the context of these other buzzwords, right? Like there's sustainable urbanism, then there's urban resilience, then there's smart cities, and all of the people who aren't urban planning wonks are just looking at this like, what, you're talking gibberish. And so a lot of times I'll break that down. It's okay, sustainability is trying to, whatever your project is, your city, your building, your project, your planning effort, sustainability is going to be trying to make that thing impact the environment less negatively. And resilience is going to be trying to make the environment impact that thing less negatively. It's more of a risk perspective. But I think the other thing that Malini hit on the head here, and I know this from my own personal experience, the way that I approached sustainability and got into it to begin with, we all talked about the triple bottom line, about it being about environment and economy and social, but most people don't come to it from the social side. That's not the emphasis. It wasn't centering people. It was centering environmental desires coming out of conservation movements or environmentalist movements or other things. Or certainly in the last 10 to 15 years, it's been this economic response about making the value case, post-recession, blah, 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 blah. And I think only in the last maybe year and a half, 2 years or so, have we really, as a movement in a space, really started to even get people onto equal footing, let alone centering them in that. Another thing I think about with sustainable urbanism, and Malini also touched on this, is that we're really good about celebrating things when they come up and they're like a little bit more sustainable than before, but we're not really good at balancing that against other systemic failures. And I often have thought about this historically in terms of zoning. It's like, we'll get this nice green building and it's downtown and it's whatever and it's LEED Platinum. But meanwhile, a couple of acres of greenfield have also just been developed into suburban quarter lot homes. And on balance, are we really succeeding? Are we really achieving a sustainable urbanism? And so that's just another sort of piece of context that I always bring to this sort of definitional question. Post-COVID, I think right now we're in a moment of advocacy for cities. The numbers that we have seen on revenue hits, anticipated shortfalls, are somewhere between 20 and 30% for city budgets. That's what they're looking at in terms of how much they're going to have to cut next year compared to this year. And I want everybody to be mindful that at the National League of Cities, we know that most cities in this country never recovered from the last recession. Their staffs are still short from where they were in 2006, 2007. Their budgets are still short on an annualized basis. And in a lot of ways, the recovery, whether it's a federal aid package or a lot of other things, this recovery is going to be our last best chance at climate mitigation. The environmental aspects of the Green New Deal are estimated to cost somewhere between $6 and $10 trillion over 10 years. And in the last quarter, we just spent $3 or $4 trillion in stimulus to try and prop up these things. So I don't want anybody to come at me and say that like the Green New Deal is not affordable, because if we treat it as a crisis, we can do these things, and particularly the environmentally sustainable portions of them. But if we don't take this recovery opportunity and we don't make this money create a new normal, not bounce back to normal, pre-COVID normal, then we're talking about trillions of dollars of misspent capital, of wasted investment. And then I do worry that we're going to be focused a lot more on adaptation in the future than we are mitigation. So everybody get out there and fill out your censuses and vote and make sure that we have this opportunity right now to make these investments while we're spending this money.
Thanks, Cooper.
Great. So this is Trey again. I got so excited about the first half of the question, I totally neglected the post-COVID side of the question. And it's been interesting watching the impact on the nonprofit world and on the environmental world from COVID. So we've been canceling, like everybody, we've been canceling events left and right. We can't do any kind of in-person outreach. We can't have cleanups where we gather people. We can't do boat tours of the river where we have people on the same boat, usually people that don't know each other, so they're not all the same household. It's been very interesting to watch that happen. some of the good things, and we were actually discussing it just amongst the panelists before, is that we've all discovered the asset that is this virtual platform. So we just had a green infrastructure webinar presentation with a Q&A last week, where we had 35 people show up to something that previously or in person probably would have had 15 or 20 people. But the benefits of people not having to physically come out, the benefits of being able to reach people from a broader geographic audience have been really, really important to us. For water and COVID, this will segue a little bit into the next bit, but it's been really fascinating to watch people's values shift, at least how they state their value and how they spend their time, and the fact that they are spending a lot more time in environment. So we've seen the river suddenly engaged with all of these people that have lived in DC, some of them for like 5 years. And I just had a conversation with a gentleman at Anacostia Park yesterday who was talking about the fact that he and his wife bought a house in Anacostia 4 years ago, and they never really came to Anacostia Park until now. So they knew about the river. They had some, run the trails, bike the trails, this and that, but they never really spent a lot of time there. So I'm very interested to see sustainability post-COVID involving those public spaces in ways that aren't just this is green space or this is trees that are helping with climate or it's this or that, but getting back to the points about intersectionality, the intersection of people and policy and mental health and physical health and environmental health and how they all kind of come together in those spaces.
Great, thank you. I know that I see folks are already using the Q&A option, but please, if you have questions at any point throughout this webinar, submit them. We will have a portion at the end for audience Q&A, and then if not, we always try and answer questions in follow-up emails. So with that, another question, let's see. So Greater Washington supports the expansion of public space at all times, but especially now with the need for recreational activity and its relation to mental health. Especially at the same time, the recent killing of George Floyd was a brutal reminder that not all people experience public space in the same way. What goes into creating good public space, and how can we make sure it's accessible, just, and functions for all users?
I got started with my previous point about the greatly increased use of environmental spaces and green spaces during COVID. Part of that is accessibility. So the Anacostia River, one of the reasons why people are having to suddenly rediscover it is that only in the past 5 years have we had a trail system that brought people from point A to point B along the river. There were a handful of dead-end trails here and there, but there weren't commuter trails, there weren't trails long enough to use for fitness or for anything else. So we also didn't have people living right against the river. So if you were ever out on the river, you'll notice a very drastic lack of seeing people's apartments or houses from the river. It's almost all public land, which is good for some purposes, like keeping the land in public trust and hopefully making it more sustainable with regards to kind of physical resiliency. But it also means that people don't relate directly to the river as much because they can't get there as easy. So if you live in Anacostia proper, you have a couple footpath entries and a couple of driving entries into Anacostia Park. But those are, for at least vehicular access, they're closed right now during COVID. Normally they're closed at night. And you have to go under a highway. So you actually have to go under the highway overpass or across a pedestrian overpass path to get over the highway. So either way, you have Highway 295 between you and the river itself. You can't see the river from most places, and it's not a comfortable, personable walk to get there. It's kind of an ugly path to get there and not always safe. Even those people living in Capitol Hill, there's demographics have changed. We think of Capitol Hill now as being a lot of privilege, a lot of access to resources. They also can't get directly to the Anacostia River. There is a railroad between them. There are another highway there. There's highway on-ramps and off-ramps. So there's, with the exception of Yards Park area, there is a distinct lack of direct access to the river. Another spot that's interesting to look at with that is Buzzard Point. So there's about to be 1,000 new units delivering on Buzzard Point just in the space of this year. Previously, it's been a very long time since anyone actually lived within about a quarter mile of the water down there. There's a lot of apartments just about a half mile from the river, but nothing within a 10 or 12-minute walk. With regards to with access, and that the access has improved largely from places like Capitol Hill. It's still physically hard around barriers like highways and train tracks, but the neighborhoods are forming in, they're meshing in. Yards Park and Capitol Riverfront Business Improvement District are case in point. You know, there's now a direct walking path that a lot of people at least feel pretty safe using. Something that's been interesting for us looking at the development of the wharf along the Washington Channel, which is technically part of the Anacostia watershed, versus Yards Park, is the different in feelings that we hear anecdotally. So a lot of people talk about the wharf not feeling necessarily like it's part of DC proper, or like it's for DC natives. Versus Councilmember Allen, I think, was the first person I heard say it besides my own head. But I've always, as people started coming into Yards Park, which is near our office and where we do events like Friday Night Fishing, where we take off with tours, so we're there quite a bit, and we were before all the apartments came in. As those public parks opened up, it's been impressive, the diversity of people that come there and seem to feel pretty comfortable there. And I've heard that vetted at different meetings from a lot of different audiences. So I'm not 100% sure what made Yards Park area such a great success for feeling welcoming to a lot of different people. But it's notable that within a mile of each other, you have these two very, very, almost the same timelines too, but very, very different feels, and the response of different demographics and audiences to those feels has been pretty distinct.
Yeah, thanks for this really excellent question. And I really want to focus my answer on the relationship between Black lives and public space. And to do this, I want to direct people's attention to the brilliant book by the Black ecologist Carolyn Finney, last name Finney, and the book is titled Black Faces, White Spaces, Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans to the Great Outdoors. Finney actually recently wrote a column in The Guardian, which was titled The Perils of Being Black in Public. We Are All Christian Cooper and George Floyd. It was actually published yesterday in The Guardian. And, you know, she's referring, of course, to the case of Amy Cooper and her ridiculous threatening of Christian Cooper in Central Park, Christian Cooper being a Black birder. And then with the Ahmaud Arbery case, was a Black jogger who was murdered in cold blood. And then, of course, with the case of the brutality against George Floyd, if it happened on a street corner by a corner store, right? And so I think the question of Black lives and the peril, the literal peril they're in public space is really key. And since summer is here, I want to answer this question both in thinking about reimagining public space as well as public space outdoors as well as public space indoors, right? So they're two different types of spaces. And so on the outdoors, I think Trey has given us a really good kind of menu of all these places that are being valued in new ways, and that's really great. I think, you know, as a mother of two young boys, we couldn't have survived these 3 months in lockdown without the creeks and the trails, Rock Creek, Needwood Lake, and also Yards Park down in DC, with, you know, without sort of open access. Some of these places are racially inclusive, some places are less racially inclusive. And I've been thinking, you know, what needs to happen to make Black and brown faces in these spaces familiar sightings, right? And what we need is more Black and brown park rangers. We need Black and brown people to be the face of camping and fishing and REI and Subaru advertisements, right? I mean, you know, when's the last time you saw a Subaru REI advertisement with a Black family camping, right? It's not as typical, let's be honest, right? And so there are all these ways of cultural messaging that we continue to reinstate the naturalness of white people in outdoor spaces and the unnaturalness in some ways of Black and brown people in outdoor spaces. And that needs to really change. Our messaging around that needs to change. Okay. So, and then And then can we think about public space in this really diverse way? So we seem to have an obsession with dog parks and tennis courts and golf courses, for instance, right? And you see these types of outdoor spaces being very white, right? But what about outdoor dance spaces or slow streets with food scenes or art installations or murals or skate parks or basketball courts, right? All of these are forms of outdoor spaces. Of course, the trails and the beautiful sort of mental peace of mind that being out in nature gives you. But in addition, right, we have to have a broader sense of what outdoor space means. On the indoor space stuff, it's really crucial too, because summer is here. Today was a good reminder of that. It was up in the 90s, so was yesterday. And we're gonna need public cooling centers, right? Especially in the absence of pools opening this summer. And so for me, especially in low-income neighborhoods where the price of air conditioning bills is so exorbitant, such an exorbitant burden on people's paychecks, they're not maybe able to run their air conditioning all day. Maybe they don't even have an air conditioner, right? I'm sure it will come as no surprise to the people who are attending this webinar that in fact air conditioners are not universally available to Americans who live in warm places with warm summers. So we need cooling centers that work, and we need those to be cognizant of the kind of health precautions we're taking these days, right? So in terms of the masks, in terms of the 6 feet, in terms of the sanitizing. So I'm hoping that this conversation on public space and Black lives is really thinking about these different types of spaces, but also the ways in which we message who belongs in such space and who does not.
Well, this isn't a particular area of my expertise, so right off the bat, I'm going to point people to first the Trust for Public Lands 10-minute walk campaign, specifically about accessibility and the ability to be able to get to a park in an open space, public space. It's not just about accessibility, it is about quality of that space. And the second thing I'm sort of reacting to what Malini just said is it's not, all of what she just said is not absent from our law, like loitering laws, making the space actually public. Is really important, and not over programming and restricting it to the uses that the designer or the people who are part of the process thought they wanted out of that space, but making them more flexible, more open, more public, thinking about relatively good public spaces locally, like the Columbia Heights Plaza, virtually unprogrammed. I know it's won a few, at least ULI awards. Thinking more internationally about just something as simple as food courts. I saw an article about, maybe we can shut down some streets and actually expand to outdoor dining and have, parking lot restaurants or whatever. It's like most of the rest of the world just calls that food court. It's something that pops up, food truck fiestas or whatever, or just a natural part of like the nightly life, because when people go home from work, the parking lot's empty and you can use it. And so I think that's one, that's an important aspect of it. And the other is just density. You need the level of people using the space to make it safer. And in a lot of spaces around the world, I think just the actual usability of the space, the fact that people actually are able to easily find their way because it's close to them, because there is a level of urban density, is important. And then the last thing I'll just sort of underappreciated the design element. I remember I saw a tweet a couple weeks ago from Jeff Speck, who's also another really, really great resource for these kinds of walkable public spaces, is that living room feel, like actually enclosing a public space with other buildings, so that you actually, his point on the tweet was you can't see out of the plazas in, at the time it was like a tiny German city plaza. And the photo just said, why is this so beautiful? Like, what is it about this thing? And he's an architect and planner and things like that. And you said, there's all the obvious things about like visual detail or whatever, but you can't see out of it. You sit in it, and it's a public space as an urban public space. Those are a few good resources, but like I said, not the space design, the interaction of people with space is not my personal expertise, and definitely Greater Washington has people who are better at this than I am to answer that particular question.
Great, thanks so much, everyone. Yeah, Greater Washington actually has been writing a little bit about public space and how we use public space and to be accessible over the last couple of days. So if you're curious, definitely check out ggwash.org. But Malini, you brought up a really great point, and I want to ask Trey, since he's our resident river expert here. One of the things that we've been talking a lot sort of internally about as community is, especially in, I mean, let me give some context to folks that are joining us that are not from DC. DC summers are extremely hot. They're extremely humid. They're not the most pleasant season for sure. And so also we are familiar with the urban heat island effect. So Trey, sort of the question that I wanted to ask you was, knowing that the hottest areas of our city tend to also be the poorest, and the areas where residents tend to rely on public cooling centers like pools and air-conditioned rec centers and libraries, knowing that these facilities are probably going to have limited access this summer because of the virus and the need to social distance, how do you see urban waterways factoring into cooling solutions?
Yeah, so it's very timely. For reference, I'm from southeastern coastal North Carolina. I drive 6 hours south if I want to go home and see my family. And in the summer, after driving 6 hours south, it is 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit cooler at home than it is here in DC. So I am many, many degrees of latitude further south, and it is 10 to 15 degrees cooler because we have the ocean there, and it's not an urban area. It's a broken up urban suburban. There's not the heat island effect there. DC is the hottest place I've ever lived, and I've spent years living in the Caribbean and tropics and doing kind of biology work different places. My personal record was set last summer. I think it was July, and it was a heat index of 118 degrees Fahrenheit. And I was on a boat tour. I was giving a tour, and it was quite comfortable on the tour in the afternoon. We've got shades in the boat, but it's still out and exposed. But getting to and from the boat was pretty miserable. And I like saying that the Anacostia River is the best seat in the city when it's hot and it's summer. And it's an important point, right? So a lot of people that aren't used to thinking of cities from a planning scale or from a social access and human rights and a public health scale, people think public health, they think diseases, they think COVID, they think a lot of things. They don't think that you are guaranteed, sort of, but we try to guarantee the right to a roof over your head. There are resources for that. There are some resources to help low-income people with power bills, but you are not guaranteed access to air conditioning. You are not guaranteed physical access to an air conditioning machine. You are not guaranteed access to the cash on hand to pay for running it. And you're not even guaranteed, if you want to look more globally at places like Paris, you're not guaranteed to live in a building that's wired to support an air conditioner. So that's less of a problem in the US, but it is still a problem structurally. So in cities, there is a physical health need to be outside. And people look at the cities that have all these swimming pools and they think, wow, that's super deluxe. And it's not deluxe, it's a matter of public health. It's a matter of surviving those 105, 110 unadjusted degree temperature days, never mind the 118 with the heat index. So a couple things, right? Please, #come to the river. We want you down by the river. Come down to the river. There's a lot of areas that are shaded. There's a lot of parks that are closed, like the National Arboretum. We hope it'll reopen soon. But there's a lot that are still open in one scale or another. And there's a lot of shade. There's a lot of trails that go up from DC into Maryland. So if you have access to a bicycle or rollerblade or something else, or if you take the time to walk at all, you can access some of those tributary areas, or up Rock Creek, for instance. There's a reason why Rock Creek runs down the middle of DC. It's because people that were planning DC way back were really smart, and they realized there would be this need for green space, especially shaded, cool space near water. And those spaces are much more physically comfortable in the summer, not just because of the shade, but because the water itself is pulling that heat. Please do not go swimming in any natural body of water in DC. It is illegal, and it has been since the 70s. There's a reason why it's illegal. It's because we have a lot of sewage overflow into our bodies of water. And it's not just the Anacostia. Rock Creek has actually been the worst. And some of the resources that we're going to send out afterwards, I'm going to attach links to Anacostia Riverkeeper's water quality monitoring. We just were out yesterday, and the link for the new data should be posting any time now. Actually, probably about an hour ago. But we're finding that the Anacostia River the past couple of years has actually been relatively clean. That does not mean you should go swimming. Yesterday, while I was out monitoring the river, I saw one gentleman swimming off of a park, which will not be named right now. And I took his picture with his permission, and we'll have that in some of our media coming up. But then I drove by a marina and I saw two kids, these two kids' families own a boat. They are fairly privileged. They are fairly well educated, and they were jumping off the second story of that boat into the Anacostia River. It's the education issue is an interesting one with this particular issue. But please, don't go swimming. It's illegal. We also saw next door for Kingman Park a couple weeks ago, or about a week ago, that somebody had noted a bunch of kids swimming off of the area over there. So please don't go swimming. It is not legal yet. We're documenting when it would be safe, but it's also proof, the proof is in the pudding, right? Like, people are already finding the water. I watched an entire summer camp jump into the river last year when it was hot. We've seen people swimming. We see people who are homeless bathing and doing laundry. So the very first time that we ever sampled water quality on Rock Creek, down under one of the bridges near P Street, we actually saw not one, but two gentlemen. One was bathing. He had a little camp a bit upstream of where we were, but we could see his area. Another one, so we're looking at him, and then we look downstream and we see a guy with his shoes off and his shirt off, and he's doing his laundry on a rock in Rock Creek. So it's not just people's recreational access. This is a matter of survival in this kind of habitat, or this kind of urban area in the summer like this. And it's an important one to note. The guidance is going to remain that you should not swim. So we're working to lift that ban, but we're not there yet. We don't have enough data to say this spot or that spot is actually reliably, regularly safe. We can say what it was at the time. So, but do come down near the water. So a lot of those benefits are accessible by being just through proximity in areas like the Potomac waterfront, like Rock Creek, and like the Anacostia Park areas.
Thank you so much, Trey. That's amazing. Next question I have is more about sort of structural disparities, and specifically as they relate to coronavirus. So in DC, where the African American and white populations both make up about 45% of residents, data that was recently released shows that 46% of total cases and about 76% of coronavirus deaths in the city belong to African Americans. We know that these trends are kind of showing up nationwide. Can you all unpack for us what the structural reasons behind this disparity are? I want to start with Malini here.
Yes, thank you. That data is really stark, but unfortunately is very much resembling trends in other American cities. And I think in many ways, you're seeing patterns that have long existed simply coming to the surface and being revealed by these racial disparities related to COVID-19. So to answer that question, I want to introduce another statistic, and this appeared in a great article by Jenny Gathright for the DCist in early May. And she reports that data shared by health officials say that 71% of those who have died from coronavirus had hypertension, which is a medical term for high blood pressure, and 49% had diabetes. And if you're listening to the news, you know, the medical community calls these terms comorbidities, right? So then the question, it can be, you know, what are the structural reasons behind these comorbidities that are predisposing African Americans, right, who have these comorbidities, certainly, to then being, you know, much more vulnerable to COVID-19 fatalities. And in a nutshell, the answer really boils down to racist urban planning, right? I mean, I think that people are probably very familiar with the toxic cocktail of urban renewal, highway building that concentrated Black poverty east of the river in DC, that concentrated Black poverty in many cities in America in particular areas, right? Every city has a unique geography. But this in combination with racial covenants, mortgage redlining, blockbusting, subsidies for white homeowners in the suburbs, predatory lending. And this toxic cocktail, right, which resulted in disinvestment in key services, stretched for about 50 years in the 20th century, right? From roughly the 1930s to 1980s, and then was kind of recoded in less explicitly racial language, but nevertheless, we know that predatory lending continues to happen. I mean, we saw it happening in the subprime mortgage crisis, right? And so, so what's the relationship between this toxic cocktail, right, of racist urban planning measures and these comorbidities? Well, one of the most direct things that I can illustrate with is, for instance, access to healthy food. So what causes hypertension and diabetes? Very salty, very, very refined foods, right? You look at the availability of healthy food in the district, and while the wealthiest, whitest wards have up to 10 grocery stores per ward, so where American University is located, where I work, Ward 3 has 10 grocery stores in that one ward, whereas there are only 3 grocery stores for all of Wards 7 and 8. That is 150,000 people, right? And so the lack, and now people are calling it not just food deserts, but food apartheid, right? To use the South African term for institutionalized racism, right? Food apartheid has led then to these comorbidities, which are disproportionately affecting people in these neighborhoods that were subject to racist planning, which then are leading to these fatalities, right? Combine that with the lack of transit and the lack of availability of personal vehicles to get to a grocery store, the lack of green space to actually want to go for a walk, right? So the walkability index in these neighborhoods that I just described east of the river are just not conducive to as much walking because highways slash through them and they're frankly unsafe, right? And combine that with access to healthcare and the fact that there are so few trauma centers east of the river. And so it's really these intersectional precarities that I've uncovered in my work on environmental racism in Washington, D.C. that I want to shed light on here. And when you talk about structural, it's to kind of backtrack that way. But in some cases, the causality links are alarmingly simple and straightforward.
Yes. I mean, we obviously put this panel together before the last week. And we saw the question, I think, before Thursday even, what are the structural reasons behind this disparity? And I think everybody who's on this webcast now can see better what the answer is. And it's exactly what Malini described there. There was a notion at the beginning of the pandemic that, it's contagious to everybody. It'll be some sort of great equalizer. We'll actually tackle it with something because if you're rich or poor, whatever, you're exposed to this and you can catch it. And I can't think of a single Black person that I've talked to who thought that. If it's going to be a peril, if it's going to be a vulnerability, of course it's going to disproportionately affect Black and brown communities because that's the way the institutional structural racism that we've baked in that she just described there has existed. And so, it get back to some of the things I said in my introduction that we as a sustainable urbanist movement are just starting to grapple with this. I grew up in suburban Kansas, 92% white community. You understand on an intellectual level when you go through and you study these sorts of things that yes, of course, equity is, it's a pillar of the triple bottom line, and environmental justice is rooted in some of these other things. But personally, until very, very recently, did not fully appreciate the fact that you can't deal with these other environmental and economic issues. You can't tackle disparities, racial disparities like this, what's the word I'm looking for? Not racial disparities, but the outcome disparities of this without addressing racism. And I think Malini mentioned one of the approaches that we have used in our organization. We have a separate program on race, equity, and leadership, and it was created 5 years ago post-Ferguson. And for the last 5 years, we've gone around the country educating local elected officials about the history of institutional racism in their own communities, educating them about the redlining in their own communities. Because leaders now in their own communities do not know that history. They're shocked to find out that it was legal, let alone that it was the law. And so the approach that we've been talking about institutionally now is targeted universalism. The goals are universal. We want the positive outcomes. We want the sustainability. We want the economic prosperity for everybody. Those are the goals. But to achieve that, it has to be done in a targeted way. You have to find the people who are most vulnerable or who are already not having the outcomes that you've just stated in your universal outcomes, and target those folks to be able to lift them up. And so that's sort of I don't know the author, I don't know the book, and I'll have to apologize to our moderators because I didn't look that up, but I'm just thinking of it now. But this is, it's really big stuff that for a long time I thought, we can talk about climate and we can do these things, and I'll go around the country and talk to local elected officials about sustainability, and I have peers who do the race and equity and leadership stuff, and if we need an expert in that, I'll look to them. And now, every conversation we're having throughout the National League of Cities now is not to leave it to them. We can't leave it to the race, equity, and leadership team to be the ones who address this, and we stay in our area of expertise where we're the most comfortable. I'm the sustainability environment guy, and I don't talk about those things because of the background that I have and the discomfort that I have. But no, we have to find ways to bring those conversations to the forefront no matter what. And whether or not we consider ourselves an expert in the solution, to bring the conversation up and to point out to all of our member cities that these are the problems. The problem is not just environmental. It's not just these water quality metrics that Trey's talking about, or the food desert metrics that Malini brought up. The problems are institutional and structural racism that we have inherited and need to find different long-term ways to dismantle. So we're living it right now. We're living the answer to this question right now.
So Cooper's comment about some of the structural stuff made me realize that there's something that not only goes into making public spaces better and making the environment better, but it's sort of an underlying question or a practice that's lacking, and namely that especially a lot of white people as consultants or as agency personnel are speaking for or presuming to know the responses to questions they haven't actually asked a lot of people of color. And we see it in our own work, and the environmental movement in the US is really painfully white. There are some really good, nonprofits and other groups and coalitions doing work to try to repair that from a structural point of view. But honestly, one of the easiest things to do seems to be one of the hardest, is to just listen, speak less, listen more, and set up those conversations and go to the meetings, not because you need to present on this or that, but to go build those relationships and to just listen to what's going on before you need to access that community or to do this or that outreach piece. And that's a big deal when it comes to the structural side of this. Malini mentioned that there were some really shocking, abhorrent structural practices in DC that focused people of color and poverty both together into particularly Ward 8, with some bleed over into Ward 7. The district literally applied, or the federal government at the time, the district didn't have home rule yet. But the federal government literally applied a financial lens to almost an entire quadrant of people living in Southwest when they had urban renewal, urban removal in the Southwest quadrant of DC. And if you could afford to buy a home somewhere else after they gave you what they would give you for your property that they were taking by eminent domain, great, you did that. And if you couldn't, they put you somewhere else. And that other spot was mostly in Ward 8. So the district literally focused poverty into the areas east of the river. And then 30 years later, we're scratching their heads asking why they had problems. So the Anacostia River has for very too long been used as a dividing line racially and economically. And mostly those have correlated together to people without means were mostly the people of color in the district, and they were mostly put into Ward 7 and 8. Those demographics are shifting a little bit. We're seeing it bleed out into Prince George's County as Ward 7 and 8 gentrify, as Wards 5 and 6 gentrified, and then now Ward 7 and 8 continue to gentrify. But the Anacostia River has been used as a dividing line for way too long, and we would like to see it become a gathering point instead. And there's other health impacts, right? So it's not just we, Riverkeeper, only really deal with things that are wet. So we're talking about toxics in the fish. And guess who's eating fish out of the river? It's not the people who can afford to go to Whole Foods and buy some African fish that they got from a farm that raised it by hand and it was fed all organic and everything else. You know, it's the people who are in Prince George's County, sometimes them in Montgomery County, a lot of them in Ward 7 and 8. And oftentimes it's not actually the people fishing who are actually eating the fish. There are some subsistence anglers that are fishing for food, but a lot of the anglers have seen the sores on the fish coming out of the river. They see the ones with lesions that look like zombie fish, and they know that something's up, whether however much they accept the messaging around toxics in the river or not, they at least are sort of aware. There's some vague idea that there's a problem. But there are people asking them for their catch. And it's very hard, even if you do buy the messaging that these chemicals in the fish can cause cancer, it's very difficult to sell someone who's hungry right now, who's asking you for your catch that you're going to throw away that fish in front of that person. I don't know if I could personally do it. I could talk to Arif about the risks, but I don't know if I could throw food away in front of someone who's actually hungry. And a lot of anglers choose not to do that here. There's a legacy of dump sites. Kenilworth Park, from an urban planning point of view, Kenilworth Park was not always Kenilworth Park. Kenilworth Park was a wetland. It was a tidal freshwater wetland, of which we have very little left. And the reason it's gone is because it was then turned into a dump. And it wasn't just a dump, it was a burn dump. So the areas around Ward 7 and 8, neighborhoods like Parkside, like River Terrace, a lot of others up there, they have a lot of health issues that kind of conflate with climate risk and with COVID risk from literally a century of a coal-fired power plant in their backyard and from decades of a burn dump where they were literally breathing the smoke from a trash fire all the time. And all of these things sew together the environmental racism that we see between the people living along the river and the river itself. And it's a really important aspect of the justice and equity issues that we deal with.
Thank you so much, Trey. All right, Molly, this is a bigger question sort of about climate change, but can you talk a little bit about the relationships between climate justice, health justice, and specifically how the disparate impacts of COVID-19 on communities of color intersect with larger scale climate vulnerability?
Yes, thank you. And actually, what Trey just said is a great introduction and segue to the research that we've been doing in the Kenilworth and Parkside neighborhoods of Ward 7, precisely the areas that he talked about with all the hazards, the open burning incinerator that of course now is capped, Kenilworth dump, and then also the decommissioned Benning coal-fired power plant. These are all hazards in that area that we wanted to investigate and others that predispose people to greater climate vulnerability. I think most broadly, just to define the terms, right? Both climate justice and health justice take seriously the underlying inequities and historical conditions that we've been talking about that make people more vulnerable to climate and or health-related disruptions, right? And so in many ways, many of the things that we would care about from a health point of view are also things we care about from a climate justice point of view. So our project that I launched at American University was titled From Urban Resilience to Abolitionist Climate Justice, really taking seriously Black freedom struggles in the district and how activists, organizers, faith leaders articulate a politics of emancipation and abolition, and to kind of center that in our envisioning of climate justice that really tries to get away from these technocratic resilience and greening plans that are very top down, you know, green roofs or stormwater drain accounting and all these types of tech fixes are perhaps have their role, but they can also be gentrifying forces, A, and then B, they really don't take into account these deeper histories and these deeper community-based idioms of expressing relationships with the environment or kind of understandings of climate threats. So what we did was we designed a household climate vulnerability survey, which we implemented in the Kenilworth, Parkside, and Eastland Gardens neighborhoods of Ward 7. And we combined this with archival research on some of the legacy environmental racisms that Trey was talking about, oral histories with faith leaders and community organizers in the area, including ANC commissioners in the area who took us on sort of environmental history tours of the area, which was really illuminating. And one of the major findings was that something like food insecurity is going to be really bad for both climate and health related shocks, right? And so that's an area that I've talked a little bit about already. And again, one of the major findings, you know, the people are already dealing with the challenges of getting healthy food to their kids, right? There's all types of what we now are referring to as mutual aid that exists in these neighborhoods, right? To get church donations to kids, to make sure they're getting the calories they need to focus on school, right? There's all kinds of ways in which these types of things are already happening, but there's so much distance to travel as far as food security goes. And as long as that exists, that's going to continue to be, you know, something that the threat is multiplied with storms, with disruptions that are weather related, but it's also going to be something that's disrupted with COVID. So that's one area that we found. The other thing I want to bring attention to is the prevalence of asthma in Ward 7 and 8. So this great report, it was super informative. It's called the 2018 DC Health Equity Report, shows that almost a quarter of Ward 8 residents have been diagnosed with adult asthma because of the structural features of the urban environment, right? Because they're also not getting the treatment that they need. Now, if you think about asthma, right, it's also an issue that's going to be exacerbated both by climate and by COVID, right? So last year we saw many code orange days, right? Very, very hot days in the summer where summer temperatures are so high, they lead to unhealthy levels of surface ozone. That's really bad for asthmatic patients, right? And so climate change is making code orange days more frequent, right? Is making exacerbating asthma. And then we also know that COVID is hitting asthma patients much worse, right? Because COVID anyway reduces your airway capacity, not to mention if you're already suffering from asthma, it's bad. And so there are these really, I think, in some ways, very blatant ways that these underlying insecurities and these comorbidities are going to be worsened both by climate and by COVID. And so that's kind of the stuff that I'm really interested in unpacking and then asking, well, what policy, intersectional policy improvements, as Montgomery County called them, can address those types of underlying issues?
Thank you so much, Malini. And definitely keep that question in mind, because I know that's actually one of the questions that has come through in the audience chat, is sort of like, what policy solutions can we realistically be talking about? I'm not going to get there yet. I want one more question for Cooper, but audience members, if you have questions, please submit them now. We're going to get into the audience Q&A once Cooper is done with this. But Cooper, I wanted to ask you a little bit about sort of sustainable cities targets. In the past few decades, we've seen cities around the world setting these really ambitious goals in attempts to mitigate climate change. And obviously, a lot of those were like, you know, coming up the next 5 years, and now we have coronavirus, and it's really changed a lot of things. What sort of big changes have you seen, sort of positively and negatively, for cities' abilities to meet these sustainability goals?
Yeah, well, there certainly have been more goals than there have been plans to achieve those goals. That's a plain fact. We have seen a lot of sign-on campaigns, a lot of endorsements, a lot of organizations who really enjoy collecting mayoral signatures so that they can go back to a funder or somebody else and tell them how many mayoral signatures they've gotten onto their thing. There are some really good ones out there. The Sierra Club runs a Ready for 100 campaign for renewable energy. The Global Covenant of Mayors is a target, and then a plan, and then an implementation step sort of process. It's a 3-step process in order to be in that. But certainly, based on current projections, there have been changes that are going to make it harder if we continue with business as usual. Possibly maybe a little bit easier if we just have to rethink all of the comprehensive plans, the capital improvement plans, and other fundamental foundational documents of a city from the ground up. I already mentioned that we've got projections between 20 and 30% revenue shortfalls for cities. States are looking at the same thing. If we don't get aid from the federal government, that's going to continue to be a problem. We're seeing sustainability and resilience professionals being furloughed or being pulled into emergency response in more of a reactive mode instead of a proactive and planning mode. And the other thing, certainly for fans of Greater Washington, many people are probably familiar with strong towns, and I won't get into the big long history of strong towns, but people should check it out. And the fundamental point that they typically make is that cities have too much infrastructure to maintain. And well, now with coronavirus, they've probably been backlogged by a couple of more months in their work to maintain that infrastructure, just the physical construction work of it, and certainly the economic ability to do that maintenance. If you've got 100 miles of road, maybe your maintenance budget is going to replace 70 of those miles within the useful life of it. You're not going to be doing things the most sustainable way. You're going to be doing things the cheapest way to get as much out of that budget as possible. And that's going to be a challenge. Now, where we have the opportunity is going to be in completely rethinking some of those other documents. Ann Arbor, Michigan just passed this week a carbon neutral goal by 2030. It's a $1 billion plan by 2030. And I'm pretty familiar with the context of this. They were in a program that we run last year that while that plan was being built, of course, the council balked at the price. So $1 billion for a city the size of Ann Arbor, it's like, 100,000 people? That sounds like a lot. Well, if you go through the capital improvement plan, annually, their capital improvement plan right now is about $125 or $150 million. I remember looking at this year's capital improvement plan and finding $30 to $40 million this year that was being dedicated to structured parking. Like, you can find the money to do things if you rethink it from the ground up and don't just sort of carry forward all of these projects that have been in your wish list since 1982. And that's where a lot of cities are at right now DC is a good example. What did we just redo our zoning code for the first time in 40 years? And those are the kinds of things that if we really take a hard look post-pandemic, if the budget cuts do come down and we have to look at 20% reductions, maybe it'll force that. Maybe it'll force us to say, we just can't keep expanding our infrastructure this way and diluting our tax base this way. So like I said at the beginning, it's this response, the stimulus from the federal government, the response from state governments, who by and large oversee transportation as well as energy production, public utility commissions at the state level, and investor-owned utilities that really aren't at the behest of city government, where most of those emissions actually come from in transportation and energy aren't the result of city policies. But this is going to be our last best chance to spend the money wisely, because it's there. if we want to find it and repurpose it. But projects that don't get us where we want to go, projects like the Intercounty Connector, we've seen on this website and other things, like those are the things that need to just be scratched off instead of the sustainability projects and goals.
Great. Thank you all so much. It's been a really great conversation so far. I've gotten some awesome questions from the audience, and I wanted to shift over to that real fast. I'm going to try and combine sort of two questions that we've gotten. One of them is this sort of policy question, I guess. I want to, let's see, if you all could all give maybe like your top two policy recommendations or things that you would like to see happen. And then specifically, I think thinking about, obviously, COVID recovery, and how can we build a healthy economy as well when we leave this time.
Yeah, that's a pretty $1 million question, I think, just because there's so much eagerness or even frustration among small businesses and folks who are struggling right now to kind of get things back on their wheels again. And while I have some amount of empathy for that impulse, I also think that we can all agree that we have to be really careful here. I think as far as when it feels like it feels safer to kind of get back into being physically present, I really like the idea that a few folks have brought up on this whole slow streets movement. I think GGWash might have done a piece on this, but it's the idea where you really, and summer is such a great time, summer and fall, spring, to do this, where you close off streets to vehicular traffic, right? And you invite, restaurants out onto the streets to sell. And this is also tackling the issue that it's kind of safer to be outdoors right now than it is to be indoors. Probably that's going to continue into the fall, right? So you close off streets to vehicular traffic. You're reducing, your carbon emissions. And then you're encouraging people to be outdoors. You're encouraging businesses to sell. It could be, and this idea of kind of reviving the arts also through street spaces, slow street spaces. As far as I can tell, policy-wise, that's not such a huge heavy lift. I mean, we do have streets already closed off in places like Seattle, some of them permanently, in cities around the country, and I think people would come to those. And I guess, practicing safe hygiene, of course, it will be essential. So for me, that's one thing that I think is fairly low-hanging fruit. I might be wrong here, but I think people would be attracted by that. So let me just start there.
Well, I think for me, the first one's relatively easy. I'm pretty convinced that the most sustainable policy that's been enacted in the last 5 years nationwide by a city is Minneapolis's decision to eliminate single-family zoning. Over the long term, does that mean every block needs to be an apartment by next year? No, it does not. And viewers of this probably understand that. But eliminating single-family zoning, the requirement for it, the limitation for it, the over-restrictiveness of it is probably the thing that I would recommend first and foremost, if I could just wave a wand. The second one is tougher, and we've been having these conversations around the idea of smart surfaces and basically like finding ways to eliminate the causes of urban heat island, and we've struggled with this because there's no just policy you can implement to find smart surfaces. Like we've defined smart surfaces as green infrastructure and as green roofs and as reflective roofs and as porous pavement and all these other things, but they add up to better tree canopy and better water infrastructure for things like combined sewer overflow for Trey. And I don't know exactly what what the there is, if there's a there, but it's design standards, it's roadway standards, it's all these things that make us just pour a bunch of concrete in order to develop, when we probably don't need that much concrete. And so it's not a clear second answer, but you know, if I had two policies, those would probably be the ones I can think of off the top of my head.
Thank you, Cooper, because you brought me to the surfaces idea. The stormwater is, if you had to pick a single one that hits a lot of other things, at least in DC, most cities in the East Coast and the Midwest, for that matter, they all have this, they all evolved about the same time. They all became city-sized at about the same time. And they all realized they had a problem with poop at the same time. And so we have these combined sewer overflows. And that was cool when not everything was paved and a lot of streams were still up. One of the most impressive resources I've ever seen is the time-lapse map of New York City. You know, if you go to New York City now, it's just urban jungle, and you see it in DC too. But if you look at these old maps, New York's like streams don't just magically avoid cities. There weren't these magical spots that were flat without waterways in them. And they were like, here, put your city here, right? All of these cities have destroyed, filled in, covered up waterways. You see it in DC. My friends own Boundary Stone, and they used to have watch parties during rainstorms to see how quickly Rhode Island Ave would flood. And it happened a lot until the DC Water Tunnel on First Street was moved up by a decade. That was not a policy issue. That was a response to a lawsuit, but it was dedicated to water quality and actually fixing the combined sewage, but it fixed flooding as well. Those smart surfaces are really important. DC is actually doing quite a bit of work right now. I don't know how much of it is public showing off yet. There's a lot of planning work going on right now, looking for underground streams and historical streams and places where water might be brought back to the surface, either by uncovering it, like in Hickey and Springhouse Run in the National Arboretum. They took a ditch and a pipe and turned it back into a stream, which brought a lot of ancillary benefits as well, health and access and environment together. But also looking at places where we might bring back surface water access as a flood prevention in a city, like a physical resilience issue. There's a Silver Jackets group in DC that's been looking at reinstating, basically rebuilding the canal along Constitutional Avenue. So the top of the mall used to be a canal. A lot of the monumental core of DC was built not by truck or train, but by barge. And the coal that was powering the city for centuries was brought in by barge. And so DC had a really interesting canal system until we subsumed it into a sewer system and then officially made it a sewer system. So the sort of stormwater things and bringing back streams where we can, even if it's just a canal, they don't only solve stormwater, but they offer us a lot of very, very long-term looking benefits for resiliency. And I had a good second one, and I totally just misplaced it. So I'm gonna leave it at that.
All right, great, thank you so much. We have one final question. It says, how can cities increase sustainability and its compatibility with citizens as smoothly as possible without disrupting the flow of business, economy, and general society? And then I think the second part of that is just like, how do we do that now during the pandemic, and then also build sustainable infrastructure to continue after the pandemic?
I think what's implicit in this question is that somehow what we had before, as far as quote unquote flow of business and the economy go, were fine, and we just need to get back to it in many ways. And I think the conversations that I've been hearing a lot is sort of, you know, what was the capitalism business as usual that we had that now is an opportunity to kind of change the way we do things, right? The extractive, highly class and racially stratified nature of capitalism, right? And I think, obviously, we haven't mentioned that in this discussion yet, but I think what a lot of scholars and activists have been talking about, right, that even the racism that we see in the wake of this police brutality, right, is in many ways feeds this kind of system in which certain people profit and other people are harmed. And so I just want to throw out there that when we talk, you have to be careful about the way we like narrate, oh, can we just get back to business, right? Is that what we want? Like, was that business as usual really something we just want to get back to? Or is there some ways now where we can think about the economy being more conducive to everyone's flourishing and survival, right? So I mean, I know that's a very theoretical and academic way to answer that question, but I think implicit was this sort of this can we just get back to normal? Well, maybe the normal wasn't right in the first place. So for me, the kinds of conversations that are happening now about, right, mutual aid, about kind of thinking beyond just the market economy, about ways in which people are sort of coming together to help each other, you know, also calling out kind of the ways in which the system is corrupt and the system is not sort of transparent to a lot of people, the way in which, you know, business lobbies are taking advantage of politics. And so I think some of that stuff is really broken. I mean, I think that conversation's coming up with like police reform, police abolition at this point, right? I mean, think about how powerful police unions are, who's funding them, right? And city governments, but then who's funding them, right? Developer lobbies, right? So I think it's really time that we don't collapse into easy rhetoric about returning to normal and really kind of question the way that we do capitalism. And obviously political rhetoric in the United States has been talking about this, and that's a conversation we need to continue to hold present as we do continue, hopefully, to get people back into jobs as well, which obviously is necessary. So anyway, I'm sorry that's a more philosophical and theoretical answer, but really I don't think there's a simple answer to this question.
Yeah, and I agree with that. The other thing I heard there, which I'm definitely extrapolating from the question, it wasn't explicitly written, is this notion of the government picking winners and losers, or sort of leaving it to a market, or disrupting a market. Like, no, government picks winners and losers, full stop. Right now, our zoning, for instance, picks single family home developers as winners and mixed use, mixed income developers as losers. And end of story, nationwide. So a lot of those things have become entrenched, and now it's seen as normal, or it's seen as, you know, the way the free market kind of works. But no, the government's picking winners and losers. And I think if you can get beyond that, to ask which winners do we really need to pick, in order to have a more sustainable urbanist society in the case, you know, context of this, or whichever topic we're looking at, then we can get to ask a couple of deeper questions about that. The other thing is, I mean, geez, the disruptions here. I don't know what the percentage of unemployment is, but environmentalism didn't do that. You know, trying to be more sustainable didn't do that. And I think pre-COVID, you saw the most ambitious cities, the most accomplished cities when it comes to implementing sustainable urbanist practices, were also the most economically productive, economically dynamic, you know, not necessarily the most equal. And there's equity considerations that need to be made there, but they were succeeding. No city has failed for being too environmentally ambitious or trying to reduce emissions too quickly. So I think that's an aspect of it, and that's sort of my quick response.
It's a false dichotomy, this idea of environment versus economy, or environment versus jobs. You know, we will create and find jobs. Someone will have an idea for a business. It's the same idea, this false dichotomy between, like, well, we need to do this for the developers because otherwise they'll leave. No developer is going to leave the DC market, right? They don't need treats to stay in the DC market. It's in their financial interest. They have a fiduciary duty, if they have stockholders, and if they don't, to themselves, to stay in the market, because there's a lot of money to be made here. even if their margins get snipped a little bit, or even if they're asked to come up with solutions. So we need cities to demonstrate stronger, firmer leadership, the ones that are able to. Not all cities have that privilege of being a market that's effectively recession-proof. But DC does, and this region does, and it needs to flex that a little bit more with the fact that you're not going to leave. We know that. So do these things and continue to be a leader in your own fields, right? So the city of DC is a leader nationally and internationally on a lot of things that I speak to with regards to water quality, with regards to urban planning and stormwater. We are a global stage leader in a lot of that work. The term green infrastructure was formed in Prince George's County, right next door. And we need to continue that role. We need to make sure that the district continues to act as a leader and continues to be willing to take some risks and to be looking at a farther ahead than so many other jurisdictions.
Great, thank you all so much. I know we just got one more question, but we are also running out of time. So I'm gonna try my best to just throw a little answer out there as I kind of give my closing remarks. But also thank you all so much for joining us today and everyone in the audience. It was really awesome to have this conversation, and I hope that we are able to continue this dialogue over the course of the next several months. But I think one of the things that was just so amazing to me, as myself, but also as a member of GGWash, is the way you are all focusing on the intersectionality of all of these issues. And I think that's at the core of urbanism. Is it's never just one thing. It's always 9 things. It's always everything. You always have to think about every single little piece and how they're all talking to each other and how they're all interacting. And we do need to start from these basic levels of what are the structural barriers to achieving what we want, and how can we unpack them and how can we undo them. So we got these questions at the very end, and sort of what is the morale around sustainability? Like, are we feeling like we have a great shot at changing the world post this moment? Do we not feel that way? And I think that, from the GGWash perspective, it's really, really up to what people decide to do. This could be a really pivotal moment. We could see an amazing solution to the transportation issue around COVID is widespread adaptation of bicycle infrastructure and biking as a lifestyle. We could reduce air pollution. We could increase the active mode of transportation for so many people. We could reduce obesity. We can increase mobility. We could also double down on being a car-centric world and do the opposite of all of those things. And it's really up to our government and the leaders and the signals that they're sending right now to make those choices. And GGWash is, really, really pushing us to be creative, to be imaginative, to think systemically about the changes that we want to see, and to really make sure that we are advocating for solutions that are multifaceted and multidimensional and aren't just hitting one target, but are really holistically thinking about the challenges we're facing right now in this moment. If you want to learn more, if you have questions, you can always reach out to me. I'm Kate. My email is on the GGWash website, and you can always reach me at info@ggwash.org. I will ask all of our panelists just to real quick, just say the best way for anyone who has further questions to reach you, and then we will say goodbye.
Great. So again, my name is Trey Sherard. I'm the Anacostia Riverkeeper, and you can reach me at Trey, T-R-E-Y, at anacostiariverkeeper.org. And you can follow us, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Anacostia Riverkeeper.
I'm Malini Ranganathan. I'm Associate Professor at American U, and you can find me online. And then my email address is Malini, my first name, @american.edu.
And Cooper Martin with the National League of Cities. It's cmartin@nlc.org. Although I can't promise that I'll be prompt in my response these days. So thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Kate and Sarah, for organizing this at the GGWash. It was really
big shout out to Sarah.
Yeah, thank you, Kate.
All right, thanks everyone.
Coming.
Happy Thursday, and see you all later.
Bye-bye. Be well.
Have a good night.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.